Dear colleagues, we continue our working day in the topic of current press conferences as follows: repressions against Crimean Tatars. What's next? We have Mr. Refat Chubarov, head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, member of parliament of Ukraine. Good afternoon, everybody. I will try to speak very briefly to have more time for questions and answers, taking into account that many mass media currently devote much attention to all these events. During the last weeks in Crimea, we witnessed considerable strengthening of repressions on behalf of occupational authorities on Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people. They started so-called court proceedings. The next court hearings will be on April 25th, but actually we can easily predict what may happen on these hearings, and the person who calls herself the prosecutor of the Crimean Republic and who actually commits all those crimes, Madame Poklonska, made decision based on the law on Russian Federation and she believes that Crimean territory should be a jurisdiction of this legislation. She recognized the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people as an extremist organization, and some days ago the Minister of Justice of Russian Federation entered the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people to this list of extremist organizations. As of today, when Russia completely controls the territory of Crimea, from the moment when Mejlis is registered as an extremist organization, so the authorities there in Crimea may apply any repressive or punitive measures as to the Mejlis members. This was the first important aspect. The second important aspect of this situation, that simultaneously with the recognition of Mejlis as an extremist organization, there was a wave of arrests and imprisonments that passed over the entire Crimean territory, and 11 members of Crimean Tatar community were arrested, and now we have 2 more young Crimean Tatar people, 23, 24 years old, and now jointly with him, Akhtam Yakozov and 2-3 other activists, we have 10 more people. Thus, we have 13 persons in total who are accused as Crimean Tatar extremists. Actually, yesterday there was a series of searches in the houses of Crimean journalists. We received information that those searches were held in the houses of 7 people, but I can mention Mykola Semenadze, one of the matters of Crimean journalists. He used to work for such newspapers as День, as Зеркало Тижня, and Известия newspaper. He is very he's a well-known figure in Crimean journalism. Also, Edda Potomeister, also a famous Crimean journalist. She is rather talented photographer, designer. We also have Ruslan Lemanov, whose place was searched, Astir Kadyrov, who was not at home, but his home was searched. And so the law enforcers came with the special documents issued by the prosecutor's office, and the main accusation there was that they develop and disseminate extremist materials that put into question the jurisdiction of Russian Federation in Crimea. So those repressive measures which are carried out by the occupational authorities during last weeks, they require not just response, they require response from the state bodies of Ukraine and from international organizations, and those responsive actions should be rather strong. And those people who are now victims of the Russian punitive system, they should be protected. As Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people, during the last weeks, we visited several world capitals, met with the state leaders, with leading politicians, representatives of international organizations, and when we visit such world capitals, we act respectively. For example, in Vilnius, we met with the head of Lithuanian Parliament, with Madam President, with the we held there the council of the Executive Council of Crimean Tatar People Congress, and there we had also a meeting of Crimean Tatar Mejlis members, and later we met with the state leaders of Lithuania, who is a NATO member. We discussed additional measures aimed at protection of Crimean Tatar people residing in Crimea. Then we participated in today's summit of the Islamic Cooperation Organization. This is the former Islamic Conference Organization. At that summit, we tried to promote inclusion of some references to the human rights violations in Crimea. Yesterday, I worked jointly with my colleagues in Strasbourg and met with president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, with the Human Rights Commissioner, and we had planned several measures. I expect that this may result in some specific actions aimed at decreasing this adverse effect on human rights in Crimea. I should say that Ukrainian leaders also made some statements in response of this situation, and offered some joint actions. In particular, Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada, Mr. Parubi, several days ago, and I myself, as the head of Mejlis, we suggested to announce the UN Security Council meeting devoted to Crimea. And we have registered there's a statement in the Ukrainian parliament today. It will be discussed in the committees. That is, we do everything possible to encourage the world to pay attention at what's going on in Crimea and respond adequately.
But all our calls upon international institutions so that they take sanctions against Russia, to force it to sit at the table of negotiations on the issue of Crimea. Such calls do not receive proper, from our point of view, response. Many politicians are thinking about that, but I believe in Europe, in Northern America, there are no politicians, there are no heads of states who wouldn't understand what's happening, what is Russia doing against Ukraine. There are no politicians who wouldn't understand what's the threat to the whole free world. But pragmatism of many leaders of the country, this pragmatism is dominating over the necessity to coordinate efforts more and to get united in order to stop this aggression of Russia. But we have to continue our work. The world will understand eventually same things that Ukraine understands, and the world, together with Ukraine, will stop Russia in its aggressive intentions. Thank you. Any questions? I see you have. Please introduce yourself. ATR TV company, Roman Spiridonov. 2 questions on this topic. How can you forecast the situation in Crimea? What will be happening to Crimean Tatars with active position? What should be the measures of the international community? What sanctions could influence the situation in Crimea? And could you provide comment on the situation related to voting at the public council, at the ombudsman? I will start from the second question. It's easy. I do not know the situation. I cannot provide comments. Today, when I was coming back from the airport, I saw that there is some discussion of that topic in social media, but I believe that I am not the support of the fact that when there are some problems in the interaction between the public authorities and the public sector should be perceived as a disaster. Like in Facebook, they're writing about that. I believe that people, when they believe that others do not want to take them into consideration, they should still put efforts into finding mutual understanding, because then the time is not wasted, and then it is possible to find a solution. I will try to react to this situation tomorrow. Now, as to what could be done by Russia in Crimea, I wouldn't want to give any final response, because in certain things I can just think about what may happen. All depends on what tasks what are the tasks of Crimean leaders of these punitive bodies, including the so-called prosecution office. This is not the initiative, the local Crimean initiative, I have no doubt in that. The task to eliminate Mejlis is the task which was set by Moscow long time ago. And I believe that there might be arrests of the mostly respected people who are members of Mejlis and non-members of Mejlis, if they are trying to do everything in retrospective, because now they are trying to to make accountable Artem for what was happening in times of Ukrainian sovereignty even. We'll see what may happen. What should be the measures taken against Russia? That is disconnecting all the financial system, SWIFT for Russia. This is not something just fashionable. That is, well, I believe the leaders of the countries have to think of what instruments they have to force Russia to at least sit at the table of negotiations. The SWIFT system, also partial or full embargo for on buying energy from Russia, oil, first of all, with all the complexity. I know logistics, I know how refinery products get to European countries, I know how important it is to get the cheaper Russian oil, because they have their own pipelines. But the threat, which is the threat to Europe, it costs, it is worth for a European community to sacrifice at least something to stop possible Third World War. Another question.
Malik Mansour, radio, the American Voice, Liberty. You mentioned your meetings at the level of the European Parliament and in Lithuania. How do you think whether all the steps made by official Kiev government and authorities in Kiev, whether these moves are sufficient to keep the Crimean Tatar issue in the political agenda of all the countries. Here, I could answer more broadly, less broadly, but speaking very concisely, I may say no. The period which we witness today, the period in Ukraine, shows presented a situation when the key actors were very heavily involved in the formation of the government, and part of the bureaucrats, they felt rather relaxed in the situation. For example, the leadership of Genichisk City Council, Mr. Tulupov, who was elected by local people, but he neglected the Crimean Tatar minority so much that I had to interfere. Near Genichisk and around Genichisk, there is a Crimean Tatar community which has been residing there from early 1960s. And from that time, they had their representative body and their executive council, and we suggested that the head of Genichisk local Mejlis had to be included to the membership of Genichisk City Council. The head of the council referred that it was the decision of the council members, but actually I had to interfere and mentioned him that politically this was a wrong decision. Ukr informed Kurtalia. Mr. Chubarov, how do you assess the results of the latest monitoring about human rights situation in Crimea produced by the Council of Europe representatives? You mentioned that the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, now when it is part of the list of extremist organizations, might result in additional repressions, and what Crimean Tatar should do to become an object of repressions. There is such a document produced by mission of Mr. Studman, special ambassador of the Council of Europe on Human Rights. He visited Crimea. Before going there, he met with authorities in Kiev. He met with me, with Mr. Mustafa Jamili. We discussed a lot of issues, and that visit happened after consent of the Ukrainian authorities, but it was going via Moscow, and Russian authorities had to agree. After that mission, which lasted between January 25th and January 31st, later, after this mission, he visited Kiev again. The report which he was expected to produce had to be released in February, but it was published in April. The objective of that visit was to study the situation with human rights, not dealing with the issue of jurisdiction of Crimea. That report was submitted to the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, and he presented that report to the members of the Council of Europe and Council of Ministers. I have noticed and I've found that there are already some mistakes in media coverage. There is no such thing as the report of the Council of Europe. This report was produced by Mr. Studman. The report is very controversial. It was not liked by neither Russian authorities nor Ukrainian authorities, and moreover not by Crimean Tatars. When the authors try to be liked by all the parties, they deviate from the line of objectivity. I believe that Mr. Studman did not manage to preserve that objectivity, that objective viewpoint. He is absolutely right when he describes terrible situation which might happen if Mejlis is prohibited. He prayed Russian Federation not to make any steps against Mejlis. On the other hand, he mentioned that the repressions in Crimea are not systemic, that this is just against those people who oppose the occupant authorities. By the way, the terminology in the report requires more clarification, but this is subject of a separate discussion with Mr. Studman. My opinion is, my vision is as follows, that any person has the right to his her own point of view, and nobody can object this. Of course, Mr. Studman has the right to have his personal point of view, especially taking into account that he was special ambassador sent by the Council of Europe. But each party can have its own point of view. Ukrainian party expected that report would be of a very practical nature and won't be public, but since that report was made public, I suggested the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to approach to the civil society, to all those civil society organizations which deal with the IDPs, which deal with the human rights in Crimea, and to check a report of Mr. Studman against the data of these organizations. They should produce their own report and also publicize it. I believe that this might be a valuable addition, valuable added value to this report. You can find this report in its English version. Especially this might be interesting to the civil society organizations in internet. Our committee will analyze this report next week, but we believe that the conclusions do not correspond to the real situation in Crimea. And I clearly understand Mr. Studman quite often used to say that he is one of those who do not try to make too much noise in order to be able to go to Crimea regularly.
Yesterday in Strasbourg, I suggested that the Council of Europe has the instruments which have the right, which have special responsibility for objectivity. The committees which monitor the conventions of the Council of Europe, 2 conventions, and the Commissionary of the Council of Europe on Human Rights. From my point of view, any international organization should stop sending to Crimea some envoy, someone, whatever status of that person is. There are responsible bodies. Once we are talking about European Parliament, that the Commissioner on Human Rights of the Parliamentary of the European Parliament, of the Commissioner on Mass Media, the UN Commissioner on Human Rights, and the UN Commissioner on Human Rights and Monitoring Committee. Thank you. So this is the end of our press conference. Thank you for coming, and see you in the future. Thank you.